Hi, this is Nell Tharp, midwife from Midwife Workshops, where we specialize in building midwife skills for suturing, knot tying, and perineal repair. Today's video is going to be about hemostasis. So we're going to talk specifically about stopping bleeding using two techniques. The first technique is using a free tie, and the second technique is applying a figure 8 stitch. These two techniques are essential for ensuring hemostasis and are great to learn in simulation. So you want to practice them until they are second nature, and they're easy to do, and your hands are used to performing each of the steps so that when you encounter bleeding in a clinical situation, you're able to apply this with ease. We're going to switch views now, and I will do some demonstrations for you. So when you decide whether you need to do a free tie or a figure of 8 stitch will depend on where the bleeding is and whether or not you can see the vessel. So generally speaking, we're going to use a free tie for bleeding vessels that are in the vaginal sulcus or under the clitoral hood or adjacent to the clitoral hood where the clitoral artery is. And the reason for using a free tie in these locations is that if we use a figure of 8 stitch, we may occlude the area of bleeding without stopping the bleeding from the vessel, and then a hematoma may result. So the reason a free tie is called a free tie is that we are using a piece of suture without a needle attached. So for this instance, I have a relatively fine piece of silk here out of my scrap suture collection. So I'm using a retractor to provide exposure so that I can see this tear that's in the vaginal sulcus. This red represents my artery that is bleeding rather briskly. And my goal is to completely occlude the vessel with a tie. Sometimes the vessel has retracted a little bit in the tissue and we can only see a little bit. If that's the case, it's acceptable to grab the tip of the vessel, but we always want to actually put our clamp all the way across. So in this instance, I'm using two vessels. One, we'll pretend this is tucked right in. Come here, I'm going to tuck you in. Tucked in there, we can barely see it. So I'm going to grasp the end, very, very gently pull it forward slightly until I can put my second clamp all the way across. And then I'll take the first clamp off. Next, I will take my fine suture and I'm going to wrap it right around my clamp. And ideally, this will be a curved clamp. But for those of you who are taking my workshops, we supply straight clamps. So that's what I've done in this instance. So I'm going to tie this firmly right around the vessel. If I am unsure whether I have tied it firmly enough, I will gently release while holding tight to my suture. I don't see any bleeding, and so I can take the clamp off. If I do see continued bleeding, I am going to reclamp it. I'm going to wrap my suture around, get it all the way around the vessel again, and then I will recommence my tying. And I did not leave myself a very long piece of suture to do this, so my apologies. Once I have assured hemostasis, I am going to gently cut my suture, and then that is my free tie. to do a figure of 8 stitch. I'm going to switch models here, so bear with me for just a moment. I'm going to think about the directionality of the blood vessel. And in this instance, we know that if we have bleeding close to the hymen, and that's where we'll often see it, the hymen will tear up in one of those stellate 2nd-degree tears right near the opening of the vagina, and there's a little bleeder underneath there. So those blood vessels all come from the side to the midline, so lateral to medial, and we want to make sure our stitch goes underneath the blood vessel if at all possible. I'm going to demonstrate it using a heavy suture simply because that's easier for you to see, but I am going to start on the side closest to the midline. I'm going to take 1 stitch, and then I'm going to take a 2nd stitch. Careful not to twist my suture. And so I will have what looks like a single interrupted on one side and then on the other. So it's like doing 2 running stitches and then we'll tie. I'm going to first, before I tie it, I'm going to compress it by actually pulling my sutures in opposite directions. You'll see the pucker of the tissue. And that will show me whether I have placed this in the location that will obtain hemostasis. If it looks good, I'm going to go ahead and tie. And in this instance, I'll do an instrument tie. So I'm going to wrap twice. We're not going to go over the details of this. And I'm going to pull it snug. It may or may not stay snug. If it doesn't, we're going to snug it down with the 2nd half of the suture. So that is my interrupted figure of 8 stitch. I have good hemostasis. I'll cut my suture and then I'll go about my repair in the usual manner. So our goal with hemostasis is to ensure that we have stopped bleeding before we go ahead and complete the rest of the repair. So the first step is stopping the bleeding, and then the next step is approximation of the tissues. So this is Nell Tharp saying goodbye. Please send your questions to us at midwifeworkshops@gmail.com. We'll use them to develop future videos. Please subscribe, and if you do, then you will get notifications when those new videos come up. And good luck with your suturing.